Welcome to the eternal life of the Black Dahlia, the story of the most famous unsolved murder in Los Angeles and the woman behind the myth who never dreamed of infamy. This is Allegra Lansing. In episode 9, The City of Broken Dreams, we follow detectives through chaos, media through frenzy, and a case that created more legends than leads. By the middle of January 1947, Elizabeth Short had ceased to exist as a young woman. She was no longer the daughter who had grown up in Medford, nor the restless girl who drifted across the country in search of love, security, or a place to belong. She was no longer the fiancée who had imagined a life with Major Matt Gordon, nor the tenant who cycled through boarding houses, or the young woman who had told her confidants 1,000 half-true stories. With the discovery of her body in Limerick Park, Elizabeth Short was consumed by something larger: the police, the press, and the public fascination. She became a case file, a headline, a myth. Her afterlife began not in memory but in interrogation rooms, newspaper columns, and the frenzied notebooks of detectives. The Los Angeles Police Department promised swift justice. They had one of the largest homicide squads in the country, and they told the city they would not rest until the killer was caught. More than 100 detectives were pulled into the hunt. The crime lab worked day and night. The department boasted that they would close the net in a matter of days. But the case that should have been a triumph became something else. Within hours, evidence was lost, rumors overshadowed facts, and the LAPD entered into a dangerous alliance with the Los Angeles Examiner, bartering exclusivity in exchange for cooperation. From that moment forward, the Black Dahlia case would be shaped as much by performance as by police work. This is where we shift our story. We spent the first 7 episodes reconstructing Elizabeth Short's life, and the 8th discovering her battered and brutalized corpse in a vacant field one January morning. Now, for the first time, we must see her through the eyes of others: detectives, reporters, suspects. It is a shift from the personal to the institutional, and it is where the failure to find her killer begins. Los Angeles in early 1947 was a city in transition. The war had ended, but stability had not yet returned. Veterans came home to uncertain futures. Women who had worked during wartime were being pushed back into domestic roles. New arrivals poured into the city, chasing opportunity and reinvention. Into this unsettled atmosphere exploded the Dahlia case, a young, beautiful, mysterious woman transformed overnight into pulp mythology. On the first day, even before Elizabeth Short had been fully identified, the framing began. Newspapers described South Norton Avenue, the vacant lot where her body was found, as a lover's lane. It wasn't. The description said more about the story reporters wanted to tell than the reality of the neighborhood. It was an early suggestion, subtle but effective, that the victim herself belonged to a certain kind of narrative. Then came the headlines. Not Elizabeth Short found dead, not young woman murdered. Instead, the Black Dahlia slain. Yes, they had discovered the nickname given to her in Long Beach. Newspapers were literally salivating at the image that name conjured, and the license it gave them to follow that dark trail. The crime was no longer simply a homicide. It was a story. The morning after Betty Bersinger's discovery of Elizabeth's severed body, newspaper stands across Los Angeles turned into stages for the same grisly drama. Headlines screamed "Black Dahlia" in thick black ink. Papers sold out before noon. Vendors ran out of copies. People bought extras to share with coworkers and neighbors. Details were read aloud in cafes. Strangers discussed the case on streetcars. Reporters spread outward quickly. Los Angeles, Miami, Boston, Chicago, Vallejo, Lompoc, Long Beach, San Diego. Doors were knocked on. Friends and acquaintances were questioned. Quotes were demanded. And with every retelling, Elizabeth's life shifted further from reality. Descriptions of her as shy or sweet came aloof or seductive in print. One acquaintance said she never drank, only to see her described days later as a barfly. The name itself began to shape perception. Somehow Black Dahlia suggested darkness, danger, an early Gothic fantasy of a woman prowling Los Angeles nightlife. Friends would later push back. They rarely saw her dressed all in black. She preferred pink, white, and red. Nor did she wear a black dahlia, a flower that does not truly exist, only deep burgundy varieties that appear black in certain light. Usually, she wore a single white flower, sometimes two, tucked behind her ears. But accuracy mattered less than imagery. Behind the scenes, the balance of power between press and police was already shifting. Examiner editor-in-chief Jimmy Richardson exerted enormous influence over coverage, often moving faster than investigators themselves. On January 24th, that shift became impossible to ignore. That morning, a small manila envelope arrived at the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. The return address read only Heaven. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its message assembled from letters cut from newspapers and magazines. Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow. The envelope contained Elizabeth Short's personal effects: her birth certificate, social security card, business cards, photographs, scraps of paper with names and phone numbers, and a small black address book embossed in gold with the name Mark Hansen. Also included was a Pacific Greyhound parcel claim check stamped January 9th. Every item had been carefully cleaned with gasoline. There was not a single usable fingerprint. The message was unmistakable. Whoever sent the packet had access to Elizabeth's belongings after her disappearance, and wanted both the police and the press to know it. And more than that, they wanted control. The claim check pointed investigators to a Greyhound depot locker in downtown Los Angeles, a locker they had not yet accessed. Now, with the ticket in hand, they could. But before they could act on it, more of Elizabeth's belongings surfaced. Later that same day, January 24th, a woman's purse and one black suede shoe were found discarded in a dump several miles from where Elizabeth's body had been left. Like the items in the mailed packet, they appeared to have been wiped clean with gasoline, stripped of any obvious forensic value. The pattern was already taking shape. Elizabeth's belongings were not being recovered through the normal course of investigation. They were being released, deliberately, selectively, into the hands of the police and the press. And the press was ready. Using the claim check from the packet, investigators moved quickly to the Greyhound depot and recovered the contents of the locker. Elizabeth's stored luggage, including suitcases, trunk, and hat boxes, tied to her final days in San Diego and Los Angeles. What happened next would further blur the line between investigation and spectacle. Instead of being opened at police headquarters, the trunk, containing Elizabeth's belongings, was taken to the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. There, in front of reporters and photographers, it was opened under police supervision. Captain Jack Donahoe assigned Sergeant Sam Flowers to oversee the process. Inside were letters from Joseph Gordon Fickling, finally identifying the pilot Elizabeth had mentioned to friends. One letter discouraged her from joining him in Texas months earlier. By the time the trunk was opened, however, the FBI had already located Fickling in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was devastated by news of Elizabeth's death and shocked to learn he had been named a suspect. He denied any engagement, insisted she was a very nice young lady, and was ruled out quickly. The experience nonetheless overwhelmed him, and within days he resigned from his new airline job. By now, homicide detectives were increasingly frustrated. Again and again, the press seemed to be not just reporting the investigation, but shaping it. A quiet arrangement developed between the Examiner and the LAPD. Certain details would be withheld in exchange for exclusive access. The result was predictable. One day Elizabeth appeared in print as a glamorous would-be actress, the next as a woman trading companionship for meals and shelter. Neither version reflected the complexity of her life, but once printed, the image hardened into public truth. The police themselves contributed to the frenzy, leaking information that should have remained confidential and allowing names of potential suspects to circulate publicly without charges. Each headline added another layer to the myth. Elizabeth Short was slowly disappearing beneath it. She was no longer a young woman whose life investigators were trying to reconstruct. She was the Black Dahlia, a symbol shaped as much by newspapers as by the crime itself. And as the story grew larger, louder, and more profitable, the investigation faced an increasingly dangerous problem. The noise was drowning out the facts, and somewhere beneath the headlines, the reality remained unchanged. A young woman had been brutally murdered, but already the myth was beginning to eclipse the girl. The investigation's first real sense of direction did not come from the crime scene itself, but from Elizabeth Short's belongings. Names, addresses, business cards, photographs. Small remnants of a life that detectives now had to reconstruct in reverse. Every item pointed towards someone who had known her, spent time with her, or crossed paths with her in the weeks before her death. In those early days, investigators followed every one of those threads. The initial phase of the inquiry spread rapidly across Los Angeles. Anyone who had contact with Elizabeth during her final weeks was located and questioned. Former boyfriends, landladies, bartenders, musicians, acquaintances, men who had given her rides or shared meals with her. Some interviews lasted hours. Others ended with individuals held overnight while detectives attempted to verify alibis and timelines. The net widened quickly. Instead of narrowing their focus, detectives found themselves adding more and more names to the list. One of the more unsettling interviews came when police finally located Elizabeth's father, Cleo Short, living in Los Angeles. He had not reached out to authorities despite learning of his daughter's death. When detectives found him at his residence on South Kingsley Drive, he was intoxicated and openly hostile. He refused to identify the body, declined to attend the upcoming inquest, and would not meet with his estranged wife as she arrived in California to claim their daughter's remains. He told investigators he wanted nothing to do with Elizabeth or the rest of the family, a statement that stunned those present. He described his daughter in harsh and unflattering terms, calling her dirty, lazy, and promiscuous. Detectives quickly recognized that these claims conflicted sharply with nearly every other account they had gathered. Friends consistently described Elizabeth as neat, careful with her appearance, and constantly trying to improve her circumstances. She did not hold steady employment, but she was rarely idle. She moved frequently, always searching for opportunity or stability. After the interview, Cleo Short's name was added to the growing list of individuals investigators could not yet eliminate. Other leads emerged from the contacts found among Elizabeth's possessions. Bill Robinson initially minimized his relationship with Elizabeth and her friend Marjorie Graham, but later admitted both women had stayed with him. His former roommate, Marvin Margulis, was reluctant to speak with police until detectives insisted on a statement. Neither man was directly implicated, but both were added to the expanding pool of possible suspects simply because of proximity. Maurice Clement's name also surfaced. A married man in his mid-40s, he acknowledged taking Elizabeth to dinner on several occasions in the fall of 1946. Friends of Elizabeth had believed he worked as a radio announcer. In reality, he was a dispatcher for Shell Oil. Though he maintained a separate apartment on Normandy Avenue, he provided an alibi that investigators could not immediately challenge. Still, his name remained on an internal list as detectives worked to account for everyone in Elizabeth's orbit. A business card led police to Dr. H. Emil Brix, a physician who had previously faced legal trouble connected to an illegal abortion case. Brix admitted Elizabeth had visited his office asking about treatment for what he vaguely described as female trouble, but said she never returned for an appointment. The conversation introduced a new possibility into the investigation, that Elizabeth might have been pregnant. In 1947, abortion was illegal, and anyone involved would have strong incentive to remain silent. For detectives, it was further validation to look towards someone with medical knowledge. At the same time, investigators struggled to interpret what the physical evidence itself suggested. Why had the body been cut in two? The act did not make disposal easier. The remains were discarded regardless. The severing seemed unnecessary from a practical standpoint, implying something else. Staging, control, or symbolism, though no consensus existed among investigators in those early weeks. The question lingered without answer. Witness statements only added to the uncertainty. A South Norton neighbor, Bob Meyer, reported seeing a dark sedan, possibly a mid-1930s Ford, parked near the lot before 7 a.m. Investigators followed those reports to a man who worked in a nearby restaurant, who admitted dumping grass clippings in the neighborhood. Other witnesses insisted the area appeared empty later that morning, suggesting the body had been left there closer to daylight. Investigators privately concluded that Elizabeth's remains had been moved after being placed in the field, as you heard in episode 8. The two portions had been repositioned, complicating efforts to establish an exact timeline. Publicly, the department projected confidence. Captain Jack Donahoe assured reporters that every lead and rumor would be pursued. Detective Harry Hansen expressed confidence that the size of the investigative team would eventually produce results. Behind the scenes, however, the case was already becoming unmanageable. False confessions began arriving almost immediately. Men walked into police stations claiming responsibility. Letters and phone calls poured in. Some confessors appeared mentally unstable. Others seemed motivated by attention or notoriety. One man announced himself as the killer before breaking down under questioning. Within the first month alone, nearly 50 false confessions had to be investigated. Over the years, that number would grow dramatically. Each claim required time. Each distraction pulled investigators further from verifiable leads. Detectives soon found themselves facing a difficult reality. The problem was not a lack of suspects, but an excess of them. Information arrived faster than it could be sorted, and much of it proved unreliable. Questions about Elizabeth herself remained unresolved. She had always been welcome at home with her mother in Massachusetts, and letters between them suggested warmth and affection rather than estrangement. Why she remained in California, moving from place to place, was unclear. Was it ambition, illness, a belief that something better awaited her there? Investigators could only speculate, but those questions shaped how they interpreted her final months. By the end of January 1947, the case had expanded beyond the department's ability to control it easily. More than 150 detectives rotated through the investigation. Hundreds of people were interviewed. In the first year alone, more than 750 formal statements would be recorded. Yet, despite the scale of the effort, progress remained elusive. Leads appeared promising and collapsed under scrutiny. The police had names, they had stories, they had fragments of Elizabeth Short's life scattered across Los Angeles. What they did not have was clarity. And as the investigation pushed forward, the circle around Elizabeth's life grew wider rather than smaller. The first leads had opened doors, but instead of pointing toward a single suspect, they revealed just how many directions the case could go. One of the first men to fall under serious suspicion in the murder of Elizabeth Short was Robert Red Manley, the last confirmed person to see Elizabeth alive. On January 8, 1947, the 25-year-old married salesman drove Elizabeth north from San Diego to Los Angeles. The two had spent time together along the coast before arriving at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th. Manley later told police that he left her in the lobby that early evening. She said she was meeting her sister. He drove away, returning to his wife and his ordinary life. Within days, that life disappeared. After Elizabeth Short's body was discovered on January 15th, the investigation exploded. Tips flooded the Los Angeles Police Department. Every man who had known her, or claimed to have, became a potential suspect. Detectives struggled to organize the flood of information, while newspapers raced to identify anyone connected to her final days. At the Los Angeles Examiner, managing editor Jimmy Richardson ordered reporters to comb coastal motels for records matching earlier witness descriptions of Elizabeth traveling with a red-haired man in a black coupe. Reporter Tommy Devlin eventually located a motel registration along the Pacific Highway that matched both the vehicle and description. License plate numbers led directly to Robert Manley. In their rush to break the story, Examiner reporters arrived at Manley's home before police did. His wife, Harriet, answered the door holding their baby. She explained that her husband was away on business in San Francisco, working as a traveling salesman for a plumbing company. When reporters asked to come inside to use the telephone, she allowed it. From inside the Manley home, they called Richardson and relayed everything they had learned. The encounter effectively exposed Manley before detectives had even spoken to him. When Hansen and Brown learned what the Examiner had done, they were furious. They appealed to Captain Donahoe to restrict cooperation with the press, worried that premature reporting would further compromise the investigation. The Examiner was warned not to publish Manley's name immediately as they had intended. The resulting article was more restrained, describing only a man traced from San Diego whose appearance and vehicle matched earlier descriptions. But the damage was done. His identity was already circulating. Only then did police move decisively. Detectives brought Manley into the Hall of Justice for questioning and kept him under guard for days. By January 20th, his name was everywhere. Newspapers branded him Dahlia's last date, and photographers followed him in and out of police custody as the public watched the investigation unfold in real time. Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown faced a familiar problem in high-profile cases: too much information and too little certainty. Hundreds of tips poured in. Sightings of dark-haired women in nightclubs were reported as fact. Rumors spread faster than investigators could verify them. In that chaos, Manley became both a suspect and a symbol, the man closest to Elizabeth before she vanished. Police interrogated him repeatedly. He appeared exhausted, frightened, and overwhelmed by the sudden attention. In one of the earliest uses of the technology in a major criminal investigation, he was subjected to lie detector testing. Police announced publicly that he had passed. Still, they kept him under guard. As Hansen told reporters, Manley would remain in the frame until detectives understood what had happened to Elizabeth after he left her. Behind the scenes, detectives examined his past more closely. His history complicated matters. During his service in the Army Air Corps as a musician, Manley had suffered psychiatric difficulties and had been hospitalized before receiving a medical discharge from Dibble Army Hospital in Redwood City. In an investigation already searching for signs of instability or violence, the detail raised concern. Under questioning, however, Manley's story never changed. He admitted he had been drawn to Elizabeth. She was, he said simply, pretty and friendly, but he insisted nothing sexual had occurred between them. Detectives initially doubted this claim, suspecting embarrassment or fear of exposing an affair. Yet even under prolonged interrogation, his account remained consistent. At one point, investigators confronted him with a false report that he had been seen with Elizabeth after leaving the Biltmore. The tactic was meant to provoke contradiction. Instead, Manley grew defensive and visibly shaken, repeating the same account he had given from the beginning. In an unusual move, veteran crime reporter Aggie Underwood was brought in to speak with him directly. Known for her bluntness, she told him plainly that he was in serious trouble and that honesty was his only path forward. With her, Manley spoke openly. He described scratches on Elizabeth's arms, which she had attributed to a jealous Italian boyfriend. Investigators later identified this likely as Sam Navarra, who was ultimately ruled out after establishing a solid alibi. Other witnesses offered simpler explanations for the injuries. Gradually, detectives began to believe Manley. Forensic testing reinforced their doubts about his involvement. Chemical analysis found no traces of blood in his car. No physical evidence connected him to the crime. The more investigators examined his movements, the less likely it appeared that he had killed Elizabeth after leaving her at the hotel. His greatest offense seemed to be marital infidelity, not murder. Still, suspicion lingered publicly. Passing a lie detector did little to quiet speculation. In the rapidly forming mythology of the Black Dahlia, Manley had already been cast in a role: the married man entangled with a mysterious woman whose image the press was reshaping into something dangerous and seductive. Manley himself tried to remain straightforward. "I dropped her at the Biltmore," he said in one interview. "That's the last I saw of her. God help me, I wish it hadn't been." Attention briefly returned to Manley's account of the drive north. He told investigators that Elizabeth seemed uneasy as they approached Los Angeles, occasionally turning to look behind them as though she believed they were being followed. He noted that she had not appeared frightened in San Diego, only on the return trip. The detail fueled speculation that someone else had been watching, following her, waiting for an opportunity after she left the Biltmore alone. But speculation was all it was. As detectives widened their investigation, dozens more names surfaced. Sailors stationed in San Diego, former acquaintances from Miami and Long Beach, men who had shared time with Elizabeth in Hollywood bars. By the end of the first week, police claimed to have interviewed more than 200 individuals. The case expanded outward in every direction. By January 22nd, detectives had eliminated their most immediate suspect, but gained no clearer understanding of who had killed Elizabeth Short. The city, meanwhile, remained transfixed. Newspapers sold out daily. Rumors of Hollywood parties, organized crime, and secret lives filled conversations in bars and living rooms alike. The investigation had become something larger than evidence. It had become a theater. And as the spotlight moved on from Red Manley, the case itself only grew darker. 1,000 leads, 1,000 theories, and no closer to the truth than the moment Elizabeth Short disappeared from the lobby of the Biltmore Hotel and into history. By the time Elizabeth Short's body was formally examined and the medical findings prepared for public record, the investigation had already become something larger than a homicide inquiry. The press had constructed a narrative. The public had begun to form opinions. What the legal inquest attempted to do, at least in theory, was something simpler: establish what could actually be known. Before that process began, Elizabeth's mother arrived in California. Phoebe Short had never flown before. Leaving Boston's Logan Airport under pressure from reporters, she ignored shouted questions as Reverend Henderson and family members helped her through the crowd. The trip itself became an ordeal. Boston to New York's LaGuardia, then west to Los Angeles with a stop in Dallas. The press followed her movements closely, documenting her grief almost as eagerly as they had documented Elizabeth's life. At the coroner's office, grief gave way to necessity. Phoebe initially could not bring herself to view her daughter's body. Virginia hesitated as well. Adrian West offered to assist, but he had never met Elizabeth and could not make a legal identification. The possibility that Elizabeth's estranged father, Cleo, might be summoned, something Phoebe had hoped to avoid, ultimately forced the decision. She asked the coroner to lift the sheet. Elizabeth had been prepared as best as possible. Her hair was washed and combed. Makeup softened some of the visible damage, but there was no disguising the violence she had endured. Phoebe and Virginia stood together, composed and silent, as Phoebe identified her daughter. There was no public display of emotion, only acceptance. Phoebe requested that Elizabeth be buried in California, near Berkeley, where the Wests were living. Elizabeth, she said, had always loved the state. The legal inquest that followed was not designed to identify a killer. Its purpose was narrower: to determine cause and manner of death based on medical findings. The coroner's report established that Elizabeth had died from hemorrhage and shock, resulting from severe blows to the head and face. Evidence suggested prolonged assault prior to death, including binding and physical restraint. The body had been cut post-mortem, cleaned, and transported before being placed at the South Norton Avenue lot where it was discovered. What the inquest could not determine was motive. No definitive evidence of sexual assault was established. No weapon was recovered. No witness could place Elizabeth with a specific individual after she was last seen alive at the Biltmore Hotel. The legal summary, stripped of speculation, amounted to a grim certainty. Elizabeth Short had been tortured and murdered by an unknown person or persons. Outside the courtroom, however, interpretation quickly filled the vacuum left by facts. One of the most influential voices shaping those interpretations was Dr. J. Paul DeRiver, a psychiatrist serving as a civilian consultant to the Los Angeles Police Department. DeRiver had spent years compiling files on what he called sex maniacs operating in Southern California and he quickly framed the Black Dahlia murder within that lens. To de River, the crime bore the hallmarks of what he described as lust murder. He argued that extreme mutilation, prolonged violence, and post-mortem injury indicated a killer seeking sexual gratification through torture. In his writings, he described such offenders as individuals driven by overwhelming sexual tension, relieved only through the physical destruction of their victims. He distinguished between lust murder and sadistic homicide only in degree, suggesting that both emerged from similar psychological impulses. These conclusions carried weight both with the press and the public. They offered something the inquest could not: explanation. But explanation is not the same as evidence. De River's theories extended beyond the physical evidence. At various points he suggested the possibility of a wronged man, someone whose violence was reactive, an individual humiliated, rejected, or emotionally wounded by Elizabeth herself. The idea quickly gained traction, reinforcing a familiar narrative in which the victim's behavior somehow provoked the crime. Yet nothing in Elizabeth's known history supported such a conclusion. There was no record of threats against her, no known history of severe violence in her relationships, no evidence that she had inspired the kind of rage capable of sustaining prolonged torture and mutilation. The only documented instance of violence toward her in that era involved a nightclub altercation weeks earlier, a single slap that bore no resemblance to the brutality of her murder. The flaw in de River's theory was simple. It assumed motive where none could be proven. The victim, not the killer, had been wronged. Meanwhile, the arrival of a taunting letter sent to newspapers, signed Black Dahlia Avenger, and declaring, "Had my fun at police," intensified speculation. The word Avenger itself became a psychological clue in the minds of some investigators, reinforcing the idea of grievance or retaliation. But whether the letter had any connection to the actual killer remained unknown. The case was already attracting hoaxes, false confessions, and individuals seeking notoriety. Even the most disturbing physical element of the crime, the deep cuts extending from the corners of Elizabeth's mouth, became subject to interpretation. Some compared the injuries to the so-called Glasgow smile, a form of mutilation historically associated with gang retaliation, intended to permanently mark and silence a victim. Others suggested the act was meant to destroy Elizabeth's beauty. Still others believed it reflected uncontrolled rage. In truth, none of these explanations could be confirmed. As the investigation continued, certain assumptions began to harden into accepted wisdom. The extent of the mutilation led many to conclude the killer must have acted out of rage. The condition of the body suggested sexual motivation, despite the absence of definitive proof. The precision of certain injuries prompted theories that the killer possessed medical knowledge. The careful placement of the body encouraged the belief that the crime was theatrical, a performance meant to shock or communicate. Over time, these ideas shaped both suspect lists and public imagination. The killer was presumed to be male, methodical, sexually deviant, and psychologically driven by humiliation or hatred toward women. Elizabeth herself was increasingly portrayed as symbolic, a modern woman whose independence had provoked violence. But these were inferences, not investigative findings. What often gets lost in the retelling of Elizabeth Short's murder is that none of these presumptions were established by the inquest or by physical evidence. Rage was inferred, not observed. Sexual motive was assumed, not proven. Medical expertise was suggested, not demonstrated. Even the idea that Elizabeth was specifically targeted rather than encountered by chance, remains unverified. The medical examiner's report told investigators how Elizabeth died. It did not tell them why. And that absence, the lack of certainty, proved almost impossible for both investigators and the public to accept. In the space where answers should have been, psychology and speculation rushed in. Over time, repetition transformed theory into apparent truth. Perhaps that is the most unsettling reality of the Black Dahlia case. It is not only that the killer's identity remains unknown, it is that the story constructed around him, his motives, his emotions, even his personality, rests largely on interpretation rather than fact. The inquest closed with the same conclusion the investigation had already reached. Elizabeth Short had been murdered by a person or persons unknown. Everything beyond that was conjecture. The investigation turned toward Mark Hansen for one simple reason: his name appeared where it should not have. Among the personal belongings mailed anonymously to the Los Angeles Examiner after Elizabeth Short's death was an address book embossed with Hansen's name. The items had been carefully cleaned with gasoline, eliminating fingerprints. Pages were missing. The message was unmistakable. Whoever sent the package wanted police and press to look closely at Elizabeth's connections, and Hansen's name was now physically attached to one of the most unsettling pieces of evidence in the case. For Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown, that made him unavoidable. Hansen explained that Elizabeth had stayed at his Carlos Avenue house during the fall of 1946, and that the address book had once belonged to him. According to his account, Elizabeth had asked if she could keep it, and he had handed it over casually. Now, months later, it had resurfaced in the possession of someone claiming knowledge of her death. The connection did not make Hansen hostile or defensive. If anything, he appeared careful. He answered questions directly, but without embellishment, offering information when asked, but rarely volunteering more than necessary. His tone toward Elizabeth was not affectionate, but neither was it openly critical. He described her as a young woman who struggled financially and moved frequently between friends' homes, someone who depended on others for temporary help while trying to establish herself in Los Angeles. What detectives heard in his account was distance or the attempt to create it for their behalf. When pressed, Hansen acknowledged that Elizabeth had asked him for money at times and that disagreements followed. He said he eventually grew frustrated with the arrangement and that she moved on. There was no suggestion of romance from his side, only the sense that Elizabeth had been one of several young women passing through his social orbit, someone he had tried to help until patience wore thin. That characterization became important because it began shaping how investigators understood Elizabeth's final months in the city. Through Hansen, they learned about the transient nature of her living situation, the way she moved between acquaintances, relying on goodwill and short-term arrangements rather than stability. It explained how she could disappear so easily, but it also risked reinforcing a narrative already forming in the press, that Elizabeth's life itself had been reckless or opportunistic. Other witnesses complicated that picture. Ann Toth, who had also known Elizabeth during her time at the house, contacted police herself after seeing her name incorrectly reported in newspapers. Unlike Hansen, Ann spoke freely and without hesitation. Detectives quickly found her cooperative and consistent, and her recollections offered a markedly different tone. Where Hansen's memories carried frustration, Ann's carried affection. She acknowledged Elizabeth's financial difficulties, but rejected the growing suggestion that she manipulated men or traded on her appearance for advantage. Anne described her as hopeful, sometimes naive, and deeply concerned with how others perceived her. She insisted Elizabeth was not a streetwalker and pushed back against the increasingly unsavory image being attached to her in newspaper coverage. In Anne's telling, Elizabeth was not calculating, but vulnerable, someone who trusted too easily and often believed things would work out even when they rarely did. This difference in perspective mattered. Detectives were not only gathering facts, they were trying to understand the victim herself. Through Hansen, Elizabeth appeared restless and dependent. Through Anne, she appeared earnest and struggling. The truth likely existed somewhere between those views, but the contrast revealed how differently Elizabeth was remembered by those closest to her. Anne also provided investigators with insight into Elizabeth's behavior during difficult periods. When she needed help, she reached out. Shortly before Christmas, Elizabeth had wired Anne asking for money, and Anne sent $20. It was the last time they communicated. For Anne, that silence after January 9th was deeply significant. She told detectives that Elizabeth would not have simply vanished without contacting someone she trusted. If she had been free to make a phone call, Anne believed she would have done so. To Anne, the absence of contact suggested that Elizabeth had not been moving freely in the days before her death. Investigators noted the observation carefully. Elizabeth's final movements remained largely unknown, and Anne's theory aligned with the growing concern that she may have been held somewhere before she was killed. This lined up with her luggage remaining at the bus depot. Elizabeth was unable to get it back and clearly unable to call a friend for help. As detectives expanded their interviews, other acquaintances added fragments to the picture. Friends described Elizabeth's evenings along Hollywood Boulevard, her habit of meeting people easily, accepting dinners or small gifts, and maintaining multiple friendships that sometimes suggested romance without becoming physical relationships. Several men reported that, despite spending time with her, their relationships never became sexual. To some investigators, this pattern raised questions. Had Elizabeth unintentionally created expectations she never intended to fulfill? Had someone interpreted rejection as humiliation? These were questions, not conclusions, but they reflected the direction the investigation was beginning to take. Attention briefly turned toward Lynn Martin, who Elizabeth had lived with along with Marjorie Graham the previous summer. Martin's discovered involvement in prostitution prompted speculation about whether Elizabeth had been drawn into similar activity. The inquiry ultimately revealed Martin to be a juvenile runaway, shifting the tone from suspicion to pity. Still, the association contributed to the broader narrative forming around Elizabeth's life, one that increasingly blurred fact with assumption. Through all of this, Mark Hansen remained a central but ambiguous figure. The address book ensured that his connection to Elizabeth would never entirely disappear from the investigation, yet nothing he said, and nothing detectives uncovered through him, placed him directly in the chain of events leading to her death. What he provided instead was context, a view into Elizabeth's life during the months before she vanished, and into the network of people who knew her well enough to remember her differently. Anne Toth continued to defend her friend publicly as the press portrayal hardened. Newspapers increasingly depicted Elizabeth as a woman drifting through men's lives, someone whose fate could be framed as inevitable. Anne rejected that idea outright. Elizabeth, she insisted, was not reckless or immoral. She was simply trying to find her place in a city that offered glamour but little protection. For detectives, the frustration grew. The circle around Elizabeth's life was narrowing. They understood more about where she had lived, who she had relied upon, and how she survived in Los Angeles. Yet none of it answered the central question. They still did not know where the violence had taken place, who had controlled her final days, or why she had been chosen at all. The more clearly Elizabeth's life came into focus, the more elusive her killer became. And as the investigation pressed inward, Through friends, acquaintances, and fragments of memory, it became increasingly clear that understanding Elizabeth Short was not the same thing as solving her murder. By February 1947, the investigation had mushroomed. Captain Donahoe boasted to the press that more than 300 individuals had already been questioned. By year's end, that number would swell into the thousands. But quantity did not equal clarity. The LAPD turned its attention to Hollywood doctors. The medical precision of Elizabeth's bisection suggested surgical skill, and police quietly canvassed hospitals, medical schools, and private practices. Physicians were interviewed, backgrounds examined, schedules scrutinized. One doctor reportedly called in sick on the day Elizabeth's body was discovered, fueling rumors that briefly spread through the press. None of these inquiries produced charges or even a credible suspect. In the span of days, Elizabeth Short had ceased to be a young woman known to friends and family and had become a cultural object, the Black Dahlia. Her story no longer belonged to her. It belonged to newspaper editors, detectives scrambling for leads, and a public eager for horror and titillation in equal measure. And for the first time, the names of real people around her, men like Red Manley and Mark Hansen, were pulled into the undertow. Both had cooperated with investigators and helped police reconstruct Elizabeth's final months. Yet neither man was ever formally eliminated as a suspect. Their proximity alone ensured that suspicion lingered, preserved in headlines long after detectives had moved on to other leads. Meanwhile, police chased leads through Hollywood boarding houses and cafes. Men who had once shared a meal with Elizabeth were interrogated as though they might be killers. Casual acquaintances found themselves summoned downtown for questioning. By March, the LAPD admitted it had interviewed more than 750 men, and the scope of the investigation began to lose focus. The press amplified every new development. Suspects were named boldly on front pages, only to disappear from coverage when nothing came of it. Headlines declared breakthroughs that dissolved into dead ends within days. Corrections, when they appeared at all, were buried deep in the back pages. At the same time, Elizabeth herself became the subject of speculation. Detectives leaked details suggesting promiscuity or instability, and newspapers eagerly adopted the narrative, describing her as an adventuress or a woman of loose morals. These portrayals were at best distortions. They sold papers and diverted attention from the uncomfortable reality that the investigation was producing few results. In late January, Elizabeth's body was sent by train north for burial. Her funeral took place in Oakland, near where her sister Virginia and brother-in-law Adrian West were living. Friends and family gathered quietly, far from the frenzy that had consumed Los Angeles. Phoebe Short, who had endured the journey west and the task of identifying her daughter, now faced the finality of laying her to rest. Elizabeth, who had spent so much of her life searching for a place to belong, was finally placed somewhere permanent, though the questions surrounding her death remained unanswered. By the summer of 1947, the investigation itself had become a spectacle. The LAPD had no solid leads, but it had plenty of suspects. Suspects tried not in court, but in public opinion. At the center of it all was a young woman who could no longer speak for herself. The Black Dahlia investigation gave the world one of its most infamous unsolved murders. What it did not give was clarity. Evidence was mishandled, crime scenes contaminated, and promising leads buried beneath rumor and rivalry. In the weeks and months that followed, Elizabeth Short's humanity, her laughter, her loneliness, her longing for a place to belong, was eclipsed by the caricature that sold newspapers. And so the mystery of the Black Dahlia was created not only by the brutality of Elizabeth's murder, but by everything that followed it. The spectacle endured. The myths endured. What did not endure was the one thing Elizabeth Short truly deserved: justice. In the next episode, Confessions and Culprits, we turn to the suspects who populated those early years, the men who fell under suspicion, the witnesses whose testimonies shaped the case, and the figures who became shadows in an investigation that decades later refused to close. Some can be ruled out. Others will continue to haunt the story still. Thank you for listening to the eternal life of the Black Dahlia. Every time we speak her real name, we return a fragment of humanity to a woman the world remembers only for the way she was murdered. This is Allegra Lansing. Until next time, may we remember Elizabeth Short not for how she was found, but for how she lived and how deeply she longed to be seen. The series is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and narration by yours truly. Theme music is Black Screen by Ketsa. Link in show notes.